Welcome to episode 15 of Rise of a Nation. This episode is on Jamaica.
All right, so today we're going to dive deep, really deep, into the history of Jamaica.
Ooh, Jamaica.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story. We're talking about going from Spanish colony to British rule,
Wow.
the fight for abolition, all the way to independence.
Big changes.
Huge transformations, yeah. And we've got a ton of great sources to work with here. Really want to pull out those key insights, the things that maybe you wouldn't know just from like a casual glance at a textbook.
Right, those little surprising details.
Exactly, those details that make history come alive.
Yeah, and help us really understand not just what happened, but why it matters,
Absolutely. So no getting bogged down. We're going to keep it clear. We're going to keep it moving.
I like it. Efficient and engaging, right?
That's the goal. So let's rewind the clock. Way back to 1494. This is when Christopher Columbus, on his second voyage, lands in Jamaica.
Okay, 1494. So before we go any further, it's super important to remember that Jamaica wasn't just some empty island waiting for Columbus, right?
Right. It wasn't just discovered.
Exactly. The Taino people had been living there for centuries, had their own culture, their own way of life, and that's something we need to keep in mind as we go through this story. Now, the Spanish, they claimed the island, of course.
Yeah, they did. They named it Santiago, right?
That's right, Santiago, and it became part of this massive Spanish West Indies under the Captaincy General of Guatemala. Think of it like a giant administrative region within the Spanish Empire.
Got it. So for over 150 years, Jamaica is a Spanish territory. But I'm guessing this wasn't a peaceful, happy coexistence kind of period, was it?
Unfortunately, no, not at all. The arrival of the Spanish, it really had a devastating impact on the Taino people.
Yeah, I was afraid you were going to say that.
The sources you shared, they paint a pretty grim picture. Disease, forced labor in mines, on plantations, and outright violence.
Brutal.
It really is. It's a tragic chapter. The Taino population plummeted and their culture was suppressed. It's a reminder of the dark side of colonization and a turning point in Jamaica's demographic and cultural landscape.
It's a complete shift, yeah. Okay, fast forward to 1655, and we've got a new player on the scene. The English.
1655, that's a big year. An English invasion force shows up, and they managed to take control from the Spanish.
So how did this happen? Was it a straightforward takeover or more of a fight?
Well, it was definitely a fight, but the English were stronger. At that time, Jamaica's location, it was incredibly valuable, strategically speaking.
Right, in the middle of the Caribbean, all those trade routes?
Exactly, prime real estate.
Yeah.
English were competing with Spain for dominance in the Caribbean, and Jamaica was a key piece of that puzzle.
So this is where we get to the part of Jamaican history that I think a lot of people find fascinating, even romanticize a bit. The rise of the privateers, and that legendary town, Port Royal.
Yes, Port Royal. It's almost like stepping into a pirate movie, isn't it?
Right. The whole image of this bustling port filled with, well, let's call them entrepreneurs of questionable legality.
Entrepreneurs. I like that. But yeah, privateering, basically state-sanctioned piracy against the Spanish. It was a huge part of Jamaica's early English economy.
And Port Royal was the heart of it all.
Absolutely. The place was booming, ships coming and going, loaded with goods, treasure, all sorts of things. Think of it as a Wild West town in the Caribbean.
So beyond just the entrepreneurial spirit, how did the actual governance of Jamaica take shape under the English?
Well, it started taking a more structured form in 1661 when the Stuart monarchy appointed a civil governor. Then, the following year, Lord Windsor, the second governor, issued a proclamation that was pretty significant. It granted the non-enslaved population, basically, the English settlers at that point, the rights of English citizens.
Interesting. So they had some degree of self-governance from the beginning.
Right, and a key part of that was the right to make their own laws, which led to the establishment of an elected House of Assembly.
Sounds promising, but I'm guessing it wasn't quite as democratic as it might seem at first glance.
You're catching on quickly. While there was this elected assembly, voting was restricted, and the wealthy planters quickly took control, their main concern, maintaining their economic power, and that meant controlling the enslaved labor force that fueled their plantations.
So you've got this inherent tension from the start, right? The local planter class wanting to run things their way, and the crown wanting to maintain its authority.
Exactly, a classic power struggle. The planter-dominated assembly butted heads with the crown-appointed governors and the Stuart kings quite often, and a major sticking point was, no surprise here, the slave trade. The planters were all about it. It was the backbone of their wealth. We even see instances like when the Duke of Albemarle, who was briefly in charge, tried to curb the planters' power, only for them to lobby their way back into control after his death.
These Jamaican planters, they knew how to play the game.
Oh, they were savvy. Then you have the Glorious Revolution in England in 1689, which brings William and Mary to the throne. Now, this actually helps the Jamaican planters solidify their control over the assembly. You see, William and Mary were big on expanding English trade, and that included the slave trade.
Oh, wow. So a revolution in England actually strengthens the hand of the planter class in Jamaica.
It's a bit ironic, right? But it makes sense when you consider the economic and political dynamics at play. Plus, the new monarchs offered better military protection against foreign rivals, something the planters in Jamaica were always worried about.
Because Jamaica wasn't just this peaceful island paradise, right? There were actual attacks and conflicts going on.
Right, and a good example is the French attack in 1694, led by Jean-Baptiste Ducasse. They land at Port Morant, wreak havoc on plantations, even kidnap some enslaved people. They try to march on Spanish Town, the capital, but get pushed back by the local militia, which included planters and even some armed enslaved people defending the colony.
That's intense. It must have been a constant fear living under the threat of invasion.
Absolutely. Life on the edge, you could say. And then, just a couple of years before that French attack, you have the 1692 earthquake that devastates Port Royal.
Oh, yeah, that was a massive one.
It really was a turning point. It wasn't just about the destruction and loss of life, though that was terrible enough. Port Royal, which was this symbol of, buccaneering wealth, it's gone, literally swallowed by the sea. And with it, a whole era ends.
And what emerges is a society more and more centered around plantations, right?
Precisely. Sugar becomes king, and with it, the demand for enslaved labor skyrockets.
Yeah, let's talk about that transition. The 18th century sees this incredible boom in the sugar industry, all driven by, of course, the horrific system of slavery.
Right, it's a period of economic transformation, but built on this incredibly dark foundation. Remember how I said earlier that the enslaved African population was already larger than the white population?
Yeah, at the end of the 17th century?
Yeah. Well, in the 18th century, that disparity explodes. Jamaica becomes the top sugar producer for the British Empire at one point, providing almost 2/3 of all the sugar consumed in Britain. It's mind-boggling.
Huge profits, all built on the backs of enslaved people. And, as you can imagine, this level of exploitation led to resistance, and lots of it.
Oh, absolutely. There were constant acts of defiance, big and small. Throughout the 18th century, you have over a dozen major uprisings, the most famous being Tacky's Revolt in 1760, which spread across multiple parishes. But beyond these big rebellions, you have the constant presence and resistance of the Maroon communities.
Okay, so for those who might not know, tell us about the Maroons.
These were communities of escaped slaves who established independent settlements in the mountainous interior of Jamaica. They were incredibly skilled at guerrilla warfare, and they fought hard to maintain their freedom.
So they actually carved out their own free spaces within a colony built on slavery.
Exactly. It's really remarkable. The First Maroon War in the 1730s shows just how powerful they were. The British couldn't defeat them, and they ended up signing peace treaties in 1739 and 1740. These treaties recognized the Maroons' freedom and gave them land in exchange for agreeing not to harbor runaway slaves and to help suppress any future uprisings.
Wow, the British actually negotiating with formerly enslaved people and recognizing their autonomy. That's pretty incredible.
It's a testament to their strength and resilience. It shows how they forced the British to acknowledge their power. But it wasn't always smooth sailing within the Maroon communities either. Even Cudjoe, their legendary leader, had to put down a revolt in 1742 related to the treaty terms.
Internal conflicts, even within these liberated communities.
No, freedom doesn't always mean unity, sadly. Then fast forward to the late 1790s, and you have the Second Maroon War.
What sparked that conflict?
Well, there was this incident where some Maroons were flogged for minor offenses. They saw this as a violation of their treaty rights, which it probably was. There was also this growing mistrust on both sides. The British worried about the Maroons' growing strength, and the Maroons suspected the British of trying to undermine their autonomy.
Classic escalation of tensions.
Sadly, yeah. The Maroons put up a fierce fight, just like in the First War. But this time, they were eventually defeated, and many of them were deported to Nova Scotia and later, Sierra Leone.
Another tragic chapter, but even in defeat, the Maroons left a lasting legacy.
Absolutely. Their resistance for decades and their ability to force the British to negotiate with them, it contributed to the growing movement for abolition.
It showed that the system was vulnerable.
Exactly, and it made people in Britain question the morality and even the practicality of slavery. So we move into the 19th century, and there's finally movement towards dismantling this brutal system. In 1807, the British Parliament abolishes the slave trade. What was the immediate impact in Jamaica?
Well, it didn't end slavery outright, did it?
You're right, it didn't. The 1807 Act made it illegal to bring new enslaved Africans to Jamaica after March 1st, 1808. But the existing enslaved population, they were still in bondage, and there was still some illegal slave trading going on.
So step forward, but a long way to go.
Exactly. Historians debate the exact economic impact of this abolition of the trade. Some say it hurt the sugar industry because it limited access to cheaper labor. Others argue that the industry was still profitable using the existing enslaved population and, their descendants.
So the fight for full freedom goes on for another few decades.
Right, until 1834, when slavery is finally abolished across the British Empire, including Jamaica.
1834, a landmark year.
Huge, but it wasn't a clean break. The abolition was followed by this thing called apprenticeship.
Apprenticeship, what was that all about?
Basically, formerly enslaved people were still required to work for their former owners for a certain number of hours each week.
So not really free then, were they?
No, not truly. The idea was to transition to a wage labor system, but it was just another form of forced labor. And to add insult to injury, the former slave owners got compensated by the British government for the loss of their property, but the formerly enslaved people themselves got nothing for their years of forced labor.
Wow. Talk about adding insult to injury.
It's appalling. As you can imagine, this apprenticeship system was incredibly unpopular. There were protests, unrest, and pressure from abolitionist groups in Britain. And finally, in 1838, the apprenticeship system was ended early.
August 1st, 1838, full emancipation, finally.
A day to celebrate, but it's important to remember that emancipation brought its own set of challenges.
Yeah, I can imagine. What happened to the plantation system? How did the economy adapt?
Well, planters struggled to find reliable and affordable labor. Many formerly enslaved people, understandably, didn't want to go back to working on plantations under any conditions. Some set up their own farms, others sought work elsewhere, anything but the plantations. So, to fill the labor gap, planters started importing indentured laborers from India, China, Sierra Leone.
Wow, so Jamaica's population becomes even more diverse.
Exactly. And meanwhile, many formerly enslaved people moved away from the plantations, establishing small farms and communities in the interior of the island. It's a reshaping of the social and economic landscape.
A dramatic shift.
Yeah.
But it sounds like the second half of the 19th century was rough for Jamaica, economically speaking.
Yeah, it was a combination of factors. Low crop prices globally, droughts, plant diseases all contributed to a decline. Poverty and inequality were widespread, and this all culminated in the Morant Bay Rebellion in 1865.
Another uprising. What happened there?
Well, it started with protests over economic hardship and unfair treatment. Things escalated, there were clashes with authorities, and eventually the rebellion was brutally suppressed. But it had a major political consequence.
Which was?
The British government abolished the Jamaican House of Assembly and imposed direct rule as a crown colony in 1866. Jamaica was now directly governed by a British governor appointed by the crown.
So less local control, essentially?
Yes, much less. While the stated reason was to bring stability after Morant Bay, it also concentrated power in the hands of the colonial administration. They did try to improve things with infrastructure projects and agricultural development schemes, but the ultimate authority rested with the British governor.
And this crown colony system, it lasted for a while, right?
It did. There was a gradual reintroduction of limited self-rule starting in the 1880s with a partially elected legislative council, but full political control was a long way off. Plus, back in 1846, the Sugar Duties Act had been passed in Britain, which removed preferential treatment for Jamaican sugar. That was a huge blow to the planter class, further weakening the island's economy.
So entering the 20th century, what does the road to independence look like for Jamaica?
It's a long road, but we start to see the emergence of a strong nationalist movement, driven by figures like Marcus Garvey.
Garvey, a powerful voice for Black empowerment.
Absolutely. His Universal Negro Improvement Association, the Back to Africa movement, all contributed to this growing sense of Black pride and self-determination. This is also the time when the Rastafari movement emerges, with its own unique blend of religious, social, and political ideas.
The Rastafari movement, such a unique and influential part of Jamaican culture.
It really is. They drew inspiration from the coronation of Haile Selassie I of Ethiopia and developed this powerful critique of colonialism and Western dominance, promoting Afrocentric identity as a response to British colonial culture.
It's a movement born out of resistance, but also out of a search for identity and belonging.
Exactly. And then you have the Great Depression, the 1930s, which hit Jamaica hard, just like the rest of the world.
Economic hardship often fuels political change, doesn't it?
It certainly does. In Jamaica, it led to widespread labor unrest and the formation of new political parties, like the People's National Party, PNP, and the Jamaica Labor Party, JLP.
These become the major political forces in Jamaica, right?
They do. They represent different ideologies, different visions for Jamaica's future, but both push for greater autonomy. This leads to the new Constitution of 1944, a major step towards self-governance.
What were the key features of this new constitution?
Well, it introduced a system based on the Westminster model, with an elected House of Representatives and a legislative council. And crucially, it granted universal adult suffrage, meaning everyone over a certain age could vote, regardless of race or class.
That's a huge expansion of voting rights.
It was a big deal. It gave a voice to a much larger segment of the population. The first elections under this constitution were held that same year, 1944, and the Jamaica Labor Party won, with Alexander Bustamante as the unofficial leader of the government.
Unofficial.
Right, because while Jamaica now had more self-governing powers, the British governor still had significant authority. But the power was definitely shifting. Then, throughout the 1950s, you have a series of constitutional reforms, each one granting Jamaica more autonomy.
And this is where Norman Manley and the PNP come into play, right?
Exactly. Manley becomes chief minister in 1955 and then premier in 1959 after the PNP wins a couple of elections. There's also this brief period where Jamaica is part of the West Indies Federation, a union of several British Caribbean territories, but it doesn't last.
Jamaica decides to go alone.
Yeah, they ultimately choose to pursue their own independent path. And finally, on August 6, 1962, Jamaica achieves independence.
A historic moment, the culmination of centuries of struggle.
It really is. Alexander Bustamante, who had led the JLP to victory in the pre-independence elections, becomes Jamaica's first prime minister. Think about it. From Spanish rule to British conquest to the horrors of slavery and the fight for abolition, and finally to self-determination.
It's an incredible journey. From Columbus landing on its shores in 1494 to a sovereign nation in 1962, Jamaica's history is so rich, so complex. It's full of tragedy, but also resilience, the constant fight for freedom and self-determination.
It's a story that continues to shape Jamaica today, its culture, its people, its place in the world.
And on that note, here's something to ponder. We've talked about this long and complicated journey to independence, but what do you think are the most enduring legacies of colonialism and slavery in Jamaica today? How do those forces continue to shape the nation's identity? It's something to think about, how the past continues to resonate in the present.
A lot to unpack there, for sure.
Absolutely, but that's the beauty of history, right?
Yeah.
It keeps us thinking, keeps us questioning.
I couldn't agree more.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Jamaican history. It's been a fascinating journey, and we hope you'll continue exploring this story on your own.
Until next time.
Thank you for watching episode 15 of Rise of a Nation. If you enjoyed this podcast, please like and subscribe for more. Write in the comments which country's rise you would like me to cover next.